I would like to make another little correction. The holotropic breathwork has been credited to me, but I developed it with my wife, Christina. I have to say, late wife, Christina. So I would like to give her a credit. Very, very. She very frequently didn't get the credit even for things that she single-handedly contributed to our work, and so this is the impact of patriarchal society. I would like to emphasize that we did this work together for 40 years.
Okay, Stan, there is a monitor on the floor where you can see your own slides.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. First, I would like to thank for the invitation. I would like to thank Maurizio and Zaya, and I understand something that had to be a large team of people who worked on this. Thanks for the dedication, for the love, for the commitment. I think this is a beautiful, extremely rich program, and I feel very privileged, very honored to participate. I would like to start with this in a somewhat unusual way by actually asking you a question. There's a list of experiences of non-ordinary states of consciousness. I would like to ask you, when you read it, how many of you know those experiences from your everyday life? Okay, can we see the hands? Ooh, you can look around. Obviously, this is a somewhat self-selected audience, but still, we see this, anywhere where we go in the world. Now, the reason I'm asking is because what I will be talking about comes from now over half a century of study of these non-ordinary states, and it's much easier for people to relate to that material if they have some personal experience. I also am very fortunate because Deepak Chopra gave a great talk, and Bob Thurman just here, and they made my job much, much easier. I also asked that question because current psychiatry considered any form of non-ordinary states, maybe with the exception of dreams, if they don't repeat and they're not associated with anxiety, see them as pathological. We don't have a category mystical experience, spiritual experience. We pathologize all these states. People get tranquilizers and get hospitalized for experiences that in other cultures would be considered extremely valuable. And I have actually been interested all these years in a special subcategory of non-ordinary states that have, in my experience, healing potential, transformative potential, I believe even evolutionary potential, and also heuristic potential, H-E-U-R, which means when you experience them or where you work with them, you run into all kinds of observations for which current psychiatry, psychology does not have any explanation. In other words, those are challenges to the current paradigm, and this is something what I would like to share with you, talk about. I published a few books with the State University New York Press, and when I was approaching my 70th birthday, my editor called me and said, "Stan, we published books on different aspects of your work. Would you consider writing one book that would kind of bring it together and be like an introduction to the books that are already out?" And then there was a pause, and then she said, "And would you focus specifically on the experiences that current psychology and psychiatry cannot explain?" And then was an even longer break. And then she said, "And would we try to just sketch, what would psychology, psychiatry look like if we integrate these and make them sort of part of the conceptual framework in psychiatry and psychology?" So this we would call tall order, but I was very excited because we started having training all over the world, and there was a new generation, and we needed a manual, and this was an offer from SUNY Press to make that manual for us. So I wrote the book and gave it a deliberately provocative title, psychology of the future. I felt if I write books like The Holotropic Mind or Beyond the Brain, people can take it or leave it. If you say, this is psychology of the future, people will notice, either get excited or get pissed. Who do you think you are? Do you dare? So it's called Psychology of the Future. And I would like to share with you the basic ideas, the categories in which I believe we would have to radically change our thing to the point that very little would stay in place from current psychology, psychiatry, and psychotherapy. I am aware that this is a very controversial, very challenging statement, but I believe after these years that psychology would have to be changed that dramatically to be effective, to be able to explain things reasonably and to be able to deal with the emotional and psychosomatic problems. So when I started working with these states that have healing and transformative potential, I couldn't believe that we don't have a category for them in current psychiatry. So I decided to coin one myself, and I started calling them holotropic. Holotropic is this my name, it's a neologism. It comes from Greek. Holos means whole, and trepein means moving in the direction of something, like heliotropism, property of the plant to move towards the sun. And these are states that move us toward wholeness. When I use that term, there's somebody always who says, what do you mean moving toward wholeness? Aren't we whole already, the way we experience ourselves in everyday life? And I would say, no, we experience just a very small fraction of our experiential potential. So in these holotropic states, it expands enormously to the point that we can experience ourselves as anything from the body ego all the way to Atman Brahman, or whatever you want to call it, and anything in between can become part of our individual experience. So I frequently refer to Hinduism, Deepak last night referred to it. In Hinduism, they will tell you, we are not nama rupa, we are not name and shape, we are not body ego. Our true identity is with a spark of cosmic creative energy that we carry in our innermost being. This is called Atman. And you get certain practices, and you can empirically validate it. You can have that experience. And if you experience yourself as Atman, you also understand that that energy is identical to what is called in Hinduism Brahman, which is the energy that created this universe. Teilhard de Chardin said something similar. We are not human beings having spiritual experiences, we are spiritual beings having human experiences. So these are holotropic states. So when we talk about holotropic breathwork, this is just one of the ways we can experience holotropic states. There are many others. And this kind of the idea of the essential identity of the individual with the divine is really the secret mystical core of all major religions. So I have statements there of different religions that say that. One is the Tattvam Asi, thou art that Deepak mentioned last night. I think I have Muktananda there who said, God dwells in you as you. Jesus in the mystical tradition that God, you, and I are one. I think I have Abulafia there, something very similar, the Kabbalists, the kingdom of heaven, nay, the king of heaven is within us. Mohammed, he who discovers himself and hopefully herself, knows the Lord. And then I have Halaj there, I think, the Sufi who had that experience and dared to say it loud and got killed and burned for that statement. So now, quickly, what are the areas where we can see what I call holotropic experiences? The initiatory experiences of the shamans, which begins the career of most shamans, the journey into the underworld, being subjected to ordeals, being dismembered, die, and then being reborn and going through this magical journey. The kind of experiences that they induce when they work with their clients, the kind of experiences that we see in the rites of passage of different cultures, which are rituals enacted at the time of important biological or social transitions like birth, circumcision, puberty, marriage, and dying, of menopause, dying, of course. Then another area would be the ancient mysteries of death and rebirth. The initiates had powerful experiences, psychospiritual death, rebirth. This would fall into the category of experiences from which we can learn a lot about consciousness, about the psyche, and so on. And then there's a category of experiences which I call technologies of the sacred, which were developed in the context of the great religions. So here would belong various schools of yoga, various forms of Buddhism, Taoist exercises, Kabbalistic exercises, hesychasm, Jesus prayer, Hasidic dancing, and so on. So those are all situations in which you would find these states that can be healing, that can be transformative, and also cannot be explained by current psychiatry. So now these are the categories where I believe we would have to really radically change psychiatry and psychology. The first one has to do with the cartography of the psyche. We use a model in psychiatry, in academic and clinical psychiatry, that limits the psyche to postnatal biography. Freud said the newborn is a tabula rasa. There's nothing there that precedes birth, including birth itself. In psychiatry, we don't believe that biological birth is a psychotrauma. Unbelievable if you think about it. The reason given for it is that the cortex of the newborn baby is not myelinized. The neurons don't have the protective sheath from a substance called myelin. Now that same argument is not used against the importance of not only nursing, there's general agreement that nursing is very important, but even something like bonding. This is accepted in professional circles, that the exchange of looks between the mother and the child can influence the whole relationship between the mother and the child. Now we are asked to believe that it's possible to go through the birth canal, for 20, 30, 40, 50 hours, die and have to be resuscitated. It's not experienced, it's not recorded anywhere because the cortex is not myelinized, and then instantly after coming out, you are sensitive to such nuances like how the mother looks at you and nuances of nursing. Amazing logical gap in a category of people who are very proud of rigorous sort of logical thinking. Now you don't have to have a cortex even to have memories, you see. I think 15 years ago, Eric Kandel got a Nobel Prize for studying memory mechanisms in a sea slug called aplysia. So sea slugs have memory, but newborns cannot have memory because their cortex is not myelinized. So if you work with holotropic states, you will see daily people going through powerful experiences of biological birth. And this is a tremendous repository of difficult emotions, difficult physical sensations, out of which various forms of psychopathology can develop, emotional and psychosomatic problems. Now, beyond that, or beneath that, if you want, is another vast realm that we now call transpersonal, where you can have experiences of experiential identification with other people. You can experience group consciousness. You can identify with members of various species, and you get new information that goes way beyond anything that you studied, that you've seen in the movies or in television. You can become an eagle and really feel like an eagle, and suddenly you know how you fly, and you see the world through the eyes of the eagle. I don't have time to give you more examples. So this is a very important category of transpersonal experiences that transcends the usual boundaries that we have between ourselves and the rest of the world. Another possibility is that the transpersonal experience takes you into other centuries. You start experiencing things that happened in other countries and in other centuries, sometimes with a very convincing feeling of what's called in psychiatry déjà vu or déjà vécu. This what's happening to me now is not the first time. This happened before I once was that person. And that's a category of experiences that has, tremendous, again, heuristic importance. And then there is the realm that Jung brought to the attention of psychiatrists, which is the archetypal, the mythological realm, where we can have experiences of archetypal mythological beings or realms of cultures that we have never studied. So this is the cartography that we have to use, and very similar to the cartography that you find in the great Eastern spiritual philosophies, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and so on. Parts of it also would be found in shamanic literature. So that's the size of the psyche. The psyche is infinitely larger than the way it's presented in current psychiatry and psychology. And now, if we work on some emotional psychosomatic problems, the idea in psychiatry today is that it started sometime after you were born. There's a whole, in traditional classical psychoanalysis, and whole cartography, kind of a dynamic classification, when you link actually different problems to the time when they originated. Let's say you have oral problems like addiction, alcoholism. This psychoanalysis would also put manic depressive disorders there, which are oral. Then you have obsessive compulsive, which would be linked to the anal zone, to the time about 2-3 years of age, toilet training. Then the urethral, which would be related to fear of blunder and perfectionism. And then you have hysteria, conversion hysteria, and anxiety hysteria, the different phobias, where psychoanalysis believes that it started sometime at the age of 4, at the time when there was the Oedipus triangle or Electra triangle and so on. So everything postnatal, these things started from scratch. There was nothing that preceded them. Now, if we work with holotropic states, you always find some significant connection to your childhood, to your history. This is not that this is wrong, but it's just barely a surface, scratching the surface. If you work with breathwork or in psychedelic sessions, or if you are in spiritual emergencies, spontaneous episodes of these states, you will find out this goes deeper. This will be connected to one of the stages of birth. I talk about them as basic perinatal matrices. And then there will be even deeper roots, like to past life experiences, or some archetypal matrices, or even phylogenetic. So this seems like very bad news. Okay? We thought we just have to clean a little what happened in our childhood and everything will be fine. Now the playground is bigger. The playground is the whole universe now. Now, the good news is that there are powerful healing and transformative mechanisms associated with these sort of pre-biographical realms. So there's, for example, powerful healing that can happen when we relive birth and we express the emotions, when we release all kinds of pent-up physical energies from birth. There are powerful mechanisms of healing associated with past life experiences. I have seen people where the final resolution came after they allowed themselves to experience what they believed was, or they felt was a past life experience. Allowing some powerful archetypal form comes through can be very healing, including archetypal energy that has demonic quality, where the session looks almost like an exorcism. Then another extremely powerful healing experience is experience of cosmic unity. If you have the feeling of being one with other people, being one with nature, being one with the universe, being one with God, this is an extremely powerful healing mechanism. There's nothing that psychiatry has that comes close to it. Unfortunately, we would diagnose it as a psychosis, and we would stop it in people rather than supporting them. So this would really have to change radically. Otherwise we are really interfering with very, very powerful self-healing process. There is another important problem that is related to this, and that's the strategy of psychotherapy and self-exploration. What do we do? How do we do it? Now the problem is we have any number of schools, and each school will tell you something completely different about what are the main motivating forces in the psyche. Is it sex? Is it inferiority feelings that we are trying to overcompensate? Is it that we don't have powerful enough complete orgasms, the way Rank was talking about it? It's something that the culture is doing, when Karen Horney talked about it. So if you have a problem, you can flip a coin, you can choose a school. Each school gives you a different story, what's wrong with you. Each school asks you to do something different, and we don't seem to be bothered by that. We don't have 50 schools of chemistry where each of them has an idea what's happening when you put two substances into the test tube. And we are very offended when they don't think we are very scientific, okay, psychiatrists, psychologists. So now, what is the alternative? Jung was very, very close to this. We have a certain self-healing, powerful self-healing potential. If you go into a non-ordinary state of consciousness, into a holotropic state of consciousness, it mobilizes something like an inner radar, which will find in the body and in the psyche contents which have a strong emotional charge, what Freud called cathexis. And these kinds of elements from the unconscious that have a strong emotional charge and are in the right connection to the threshold of consciousness, so that they are available that particular day, they will emerge spontaneously, and we can use them for processing. Now, there are others that are important that we'll have to wait 3 or 4 sessions before they become ready, because before they come to the threshold of consciousness. But the process is happening spontaneously. I mean, there is a radar. We don't have to make the decision. You see, what we are going to work, how we are going to work on it. We become co-adventurers. We have to intelligently support that process, and we have to trust that there is a self-healing intelligence which is far beyond anything that we can come up with in our different schools of psychotherapy. I don't know if I have time. I'll tell you quickly a story from my own psychoanalysis that illustrates it. I was in psychoanalysis for 7 years, and I had an analyst who was probably in his 70s, and there were about 7 other psychoanalysts, psychologists, or psychiatrists, psychologists who were in the training with him. And his thing was that he frequently fell asleep during therapy, and we knew about it. We were joking about it. We had to do something to try to bring him back into the process. And we also had seminars where we could present case histories and referring about books and so on. And we could ask questions. So one of us asked the question, what happens, just a purely theoretical question, what happens if a psychoanalyst falls asleep? If I keep free associating, does therapy continue? Is the process interrupted? Should you get refunded for those periods? Money is so important. And he couldn't say this wouldn't happen. I mean, he knew we knew, so he had to do something about it. So he said, yeah, it can happen. Sometimes you are tired, you're just recovering from a flu, you didn't sleep well. Yeah, it can happen. He said, but if you are in this business for a long time, you develop this sixth sense. You fall asleep only when that stuff that's coming up is irrelevant. When something important comes up, you wake up and you're right there. Now, he was from Russia, an immigrant from Russia, and he was great admirer of Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, who got the Nobel Prize for conditioned reflexes. And Pavlov frequently talked about the inhibition of the cortex, like in sleep, and talked about hypnosis, where you can maintain a waking point. Your cortex is inhibited, but the hypnotist can get through to the waking point. And his favorite example was a mother who can sleep through heavy noises, but when her own child starts moaning, she wakes up and says, he said, it's right, just like Pavlov's mother. If something important comes out in analysis, you wake up and you're there. Well, important by whose definition? Had I had an Adlerian therapist or a Freudian therapist or Jungian, they would have fallen asleep and waked up at different parts of my narrative. Okay. So the self-healing intelligence that happens in holotropic states saves us this decision-making, what is important, what isn't. It would not come up if it's not important. If it comes up, it's important. Freud had something similar about dreams. You see, he called dreams a via regia into the unconscious, because we carry, according to Freud, these in the unconscious very heavily charged memories, and when the sensor goes down, when we go to sleep, they start emerging, and they would disturb us. So he said that dream work actually binds that and protects dream. And this is why working with dream is important, because when it gets into a dream, it has to be emotionally relevant. So if something emerges in a psychedelic session, if something emerges in the holotropic breathwork session, it is important, because otherwise it would not make it out. So this is how we have to learn to support people, even if we don't understand. Sometimes it happens in mysterious ways. I wrote a book, When the Impossible Happens. There are examples when healing happened in ways, powerful healing in ways that I don't understand to this day. And I might have an idea what should happen, where the problems were, and then something different happens and it turns out to be the right thing. So that's the strategy of self-exploration. Then another area where we would have to really radically change our understanding would be in relation to spirituality. We have science that is monistic, materialistic. The history of the universe is a history of developing matter, and life, consciousness, intelligence are latecomers, something that happened in an insignificant part of a universe that has billions, trillions of galaxies. So it's more or less like a fluke, you see. If you have this kind of understanding of the universe, say, what is spirit? What are you talking about? If you are spiritual, there's something wrong with you. You don't know your science. You don't know materialistic science discovered about the universe. This is primitive thinking. This is magical thinking. This is a primary process. Okay? And if you have experiences of the spiritual realms, you get a diagnosis, and we stop it. Okay? So in the work with holotropic states, you find out that spirituality is an essential, it's a critical dimension of the human psyche and also of the universal scheme of things. One of the things that happens typically in holotropic states is you regress, you experience age regression, and when you come to birth, this is where a new quality comes into the experience, which Jung calls numinosity, a sense of sacredness, holiness. But he preferred the term numinosity because it had not been used in a context where it can be confusing, and everybody has something different. So numinosity is a very neutral term. And the way we can think about it is like we have been watching a black and white television, and suddenly colors come into it. So if you are in a mystical state and you look around, you still recognize there are people, there are trees, there are mountains, but this is radically different. This is numinous. You have a sense this is a work of creative cosmic energy. So this is not a belief, this is a direct experiential quality. So people who, no matter what they are, they can be Marxist, communist, positivistically oriented scientists. When they reach this level in holotropic states, that's when they become spiritual, because this opens up intrinsic spiritual sources in the psyche. I worked with quite a few communists, people who traveled and they were giving lectures against spirituality and religion as the opium of masses. That it's hostile to world revolution and so on. 10 minutes, okay. And when they had this experience, when they reached at least the perinatal level, the psychospiritual death rebirth, that's when they realized, that spirituality was an essential dimension of the psyche and of reality. I think I have one which is the one that is not related just to psychology, psychiatry, but is actually undermines somehow the whole philosophy of Western science, the monistic, materialistic, showing a radically different relationship between consciousness and matter. Like that consciousness is not something that is produced in the brain. Consciousness is a phenomenon, it's an essential attribute of existence itself. It cannot be explained from anything else, it cannot be reduced to anything else. And this similar kind of perspective is now emerging in quantum relativistic physics. So don't we have, convincing evidence that consciousness is coming from the brain? Of course we don't. Very few people realize we don't have a single proof that consciousness is coming out of the brain. What we have is a number of observations showing systematic correlations between anatomy and physiology of the brain and states of consciousness. This is all there is. That is not a proof that consciousness is coming from the brain. You can look at television. You see, what happens in the set seriously influences the picture and the sound. Now, we would laugh if somebody would study the box and believe that if he or she takes it down to molecular level, studying the transistors and the circuits, that finally they would find out why a Mickey Mouse cartoon shows up at 7 o'clock on the, it's not, it's what's called non sequitur. It doesn't follow. There's still a possibility that the brain mediates it, but the program is coming from somewhere else, the way it is in television. Just because there is a connection between the brain and consciousness is not a proof. Actually, we have enormous number of observations showing the opposite, that consciousness can do things that the brain cannot possibly do. And in the academic circles don't want to look at this. You all know that people can be in a near-death situation, being resuscitated, and consciousness goes out of the body, and they watch it from the ceiling. And then they decide to go for a little trip, so you go to other rooms of the building, check what's happening there, maybe take it through the ceiling, look around, or experience something that's happening hundreds of miles away. And if you have an open-minded scientist who goes and checks, those things are verifiable. This is called veridical out-of-body experiences. And there are studies now done by people like Ken Ring, showing that this can happen to people who are congenitally blind. When they are congenitally blind and they have a near-death experience, when consciousness comes out of the body, they can see. And again, it can be validated. It can be validated by people who have the gift of science. So this is a major argument against materialistic science, and brings really the thinking in psychology and psychiatry very close to the great spiritual philosophies of the East. Did I have anything else there? Okay, I have 5 minutes. Maybe I'll run something for you. I was brought into this by volunteering for an LSD session, and I was a beginning psychiatrist. I had a totally different idea about my future in psychiatry, and I had an experience of LSD, and the man who was my preceptor who got the LSD was interested in electroencephalography, and at the time when I had the session, he was also interested in a process which was called driving the brain waves, exposing people to large stroboscopic light with different frequencies, and finding out if the brain waves in the suboccipital cortex would pick up the frequency that you are feeding in. And so all of us who wanted to have psychedelic session had to also agree that we would have our brain waves driven as part of the experiments. So what happened, I was in the middle of the session, with time for the experiment. There was a research assistant who took me to a room. I lie down, she pasted electrodes on my head and then brought this gigantic strobe and turned it on. And then in the next moment there was light like I had never seen in my life and couldn't imagine even existed. My consciousness was just catapulted out of my body, and I had the feeling of being totally extinguished, but I had the feeling I became like all there was, nothing and everything at the same time. And then as she was turning it on, I was sort of coming down. Then for a while I was in the astronomical universe. There were things happening for which I didn't even have names at the time, but later I found out about the Big Bang and the black holes and white holes and wormholes and so on. And it was something in that category. And then I finally ended up finding the clinic again, finding Prague, finding the clinic, finding my body. And then for a while, my consciousness was just circling around my body, trying to get in and align myself with my body. And finally I succeeded, and I had really a great landing. And I was very impressed. I said, I'm already stuck with psychiatry. At that time I was getting disappointed with psychoanalysis. And if you're a psychiatrist, this is by far the most interesting thing to study, these non-ordinary states. So this became a profession, a vocation, passion. I mean, I've done very little in the last, it's now 60 years really. We had a session in 56. I had done very little that was not related in one way or another. So I feel tremendously indebted to Albert Hofmann. I see him as my, spiritual father, although I didn't go to his lectures, some of them, but I didn't get it as a teaching, but the tool that he developed really changed my life radically. So I would end this quickly with a kind of a pictorial homage to Albert, just to show a few pictures of our meetings over the years. These are the perinatal matrices. Okay, so this is Albert at the time when he discovered this LSD. This was broadcast all over or shown all over the world. This is the Institute Maryland Psychiatric Research Center where we did this research. And this is Albert visiting in the late 60s. In the middle is Walter Pankey, who did the Good Friday experiment, and on the other side, Helen Bonney. She was our music therapist. This was a training module for facilitators of holotropic breathwork in a place called Wasserfallenhof in Switzerland, where we invited Albert to spend a day with us. And on my right side, or left from me, is Christina, for those of you who haven't seen her. This must have been like 25 years ago in his home in Berg, which is a small village on the French Swiss border. And this in the middle, that's Anita, that was his wife. And this is in Hoffman Garden, again, Christina is with us. And during this visit, there was kind of a fringe benefit. This was synchronistically, Roberto Venosa and Martina Hoffman visited. They are great visionary artists. Now, this is at this point we introduced Albert and Hans-Ruedi Giger is the one who got Academy Award in for the movie Alien. And this is in his museum in Gruyere, where we were doing a training module, and we invited Albert again to spend a day with us. And this is Hans Ruedi showing Albert the gallery. My last book, which came out in July, is an attempt to show how, if you use this large cartography, how you can get much deeper understanding of art. And I'm using Hans Ruedi's art as a demonstration of the perinatal level, which is not accepted by current psychiatry. This was a panel. He was 4 months from his 100th birthday, still very active. He was interested in the chemical structures that are responsible for the color of plants and the butterfly wings. Was not working on it. And this is what's Hans Ruedi Giger. And this is the end of this module. On the right side is Carmen, Hans Ruedi's wife. On the left side, Tev Sparks, who directs our training. And this was the saying goodbye. This is 4 months before his 100th birthday. And this is 100th birthday. I went back to Basel. So at this point, he's 100 years old. And then these are the last pictures I have. This is 2 years forward. It was what's called forum, psychedelic forum, a conference in Basel. He was still on the program. He was supposed to give a talk. But he decided that he was not feeling quite well, so he invited several of us. We spent the afternoon with him. These are the last photograph. This is 4 weeks before he died at the age of 102. Okay, here he is holding. Rick Dublin is his hero because he's almost single-handedly with his group, responsible for this incredible renaissance of psychedelic research that's coming. Thank you very much for your attention.